Good afternoon. My name is Todd Mathis. I'm a striped bass lead based out of the Washington office. And with me today is Charlton Godwin, who is a striped bass lead based out of the Elizabeth City office. Today we will be discussing results of the data review for the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers, looking at the effectiveness of Amendment 2 management. The data review was prescribed to occur this year as part of the Amendment 2 Adaptive Management Framework. And I want to remind the Commission that you all have a copy of the data review information paper in your meeting materials, and I will present the summary details here today. So first, we will review Amendment 2 management, and next I'll go through the data sources that were reviewed in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers, which include the DMF Juvenile Striped Bass Seine Survey, the DMF Gillnet Survey, the Wildlife Resource Commission Electrofishing Survey, DMF and WRC parentage-based tagging, or PBT, which is genetic tagging that gives us hatchery contribution, and age data, both otolith and genetic. Then we'll discuss the results, some conclusions, and next steps. So first we'll look at Amendment 2 management. Amendment 2 to the Estuarine Striped Bass FMP was adopted in November 2022, and it continued the no possession measure for Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers, which was implemented in March 2019. Amendment 2 also maintained the March 2019 gillnet closure above the ferry lines through 2024 to allow for assessment of its performance. And it maintained the 3-foot tie downs and distance from shore requirements below the ferry lines year-round for large mesh anchored gillnets. So we're here today because the Adaptive Management Framework in Amendment 2 specifies that for the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers in 2025, data through 2024 will be reviewed to determine if populations are self-sustaining and if sustainable harvest can be determined. The MFC motion to adopt Amendment 2 also included language to maintain the gillnet prohibition through 2024 to allow for assessment of its performance. So the review also assesses performance of the ferry line gillnet closures. I just want to mention that the next comprehensive FMP review is scheduled in 2027, so we're basically at the FMP midpoint. We've been tasked to review our data to assess the impact of the harvest closure on striped bass abundance before and after the closure, and to determine if gillnet closure increased striped bass numbers. The goal of Amendment 2 to the Estuarine Striped Bass FMP is to manage estuarine striped bass fisheries to achieve self-sustaining populations that provide sustainable harvest based on science-based decision-making processes. If biological and/or environmental factors prevent a self-sustaining population, then alternative management strategies will be implemented that provide protection for and access to the resource. And I underline this portion because based on the results of the analysis, this is likely where we're at. So let's start by looking at juvenile recruitment data. Natural recruitment is the biggest indicator of self-sustaining populations. The Tar-Pamlico and Neuse stocks are supported by continuous stocking efforts. Juvenile striped bass, Phase 1 and Phase 2 size striped bass, have been stocked in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers consistently since the 1980s. The table shows the last 15 years of stocking by Edenton National Fish Hatchery. You'll notice that no juveniles were stocked in the Tar-Pamlico or the Neuse rivers in 2024. Due to successive recruitment failures in the Albemarle Roanoke stock during 2017 through 2023, stocking efforts were shifted in 2024 and 2025 toward maintaining and restoring the AR stock. Because of the importance of understanding recruitment, in 2017, DMF began a juvenile abundance survey in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers using beach seines and trawl nets. As of 2024, 8 years, only 2 wild juvenile striped bass have been collected from the Tar-Pamlico River, which occurred in 2021, and no wild juveniles have been captured from the Neuse River. We know this because we use parentage-based tagging, or PBT, which tells us if a fish is hatchery or wild. In 2022 and 2023, we did catch 35 juvenile striped bass from the Tar-Pamlico River and 8 juveniles from the Neuse River, but subsequent analysis revealed that they were all stock fish released as Phase 1 striped bass. In 2022 and 2023, over 400,000 Phase 1, which are 1 to 2 inch striped bass fingerlings, were stocked into the rivers as a way to test survey methodology, because we had only captured 2 wild striped bass in 5 years. Juvenile striped bass were stocked within the survey area in June, and by catching stocked juvenile fish, we demonstrated the survey gear and design is effective. So if wild juvenile striped bass were present, we should catch them. So now let's look at the adult abundance data. I just want to take a second to mention that the harvest closure and the gill net closure occurred at the same time in March of 2019, and certainly both could impact striped bass abundance, but it's impossible to tease the two apart since they were implemented at the same time. So throughout the presentation, I will refer to the harvest and gill net closures combined as the closures. In general, the harvest and gill net closure analysis used data throughout the entire river system, above and below the ferry lines, where the gill net closure at the ferry lines analysis only used catch data from areas above the ferry lines. We evaluated adult striped bass abundance using data from the Fishery Independent Gill Net Survey, also known as Program 915. The sampling occurs in the lower parts of the Tar-Pamlico River, below Washington, and in the Neuse River below New Bern. And just to note that no sampling occurred in 2020, and limited sampling occurred in 2021 due to COVID restrictions. On these figures, the dashed line is the mean abundance before the harvest closure and gill net closures, and the dotted line is the mean abundance post-closures, or after the closures were put in place in 2019. In the rivers, abundance of adult striped bass declined after the 2019 harvest and gill net closures to the lowest value in the time series. In the Tar-Pamlico, abundance was reduced by 61%, declining from a mean of 4.3 fish per set before the closures to 1.7 fish per set after the closures. In the Neuse, abundance decreased by 42%, decreasing from 3.6 before the closures to 2.1 after the closures. A man-Kendall trend test was used to compare abundance trends from Program 915 before and after the closures. The man-Kendall analysis is a statistical test used to assess if increasing or decreasing trends over time are significant. The analysis was used to determine if there was significant trends in striped bass abundance before and after the closures. In both the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers, there was no significant trend in striped bass abundance before the closures, meaning abundance wasn't increasing or decreasing. After the closures, there was no significant trends in abundance in either river, meaning abundance wasn't increasing or decreasing. Randomization tests were also used to compare striped bass abundance from Program 915 before and after the closures to determine if striped bass abundance significantly increased or decreased after the closures. The randomization test is a statistical test used to detect significant differences between groups that relies on randomly shuffling observed data to determine if observed differences are statistically significant. In the Tar-Pamlico River, test results indicated striped bass abundance was significantly lower after the closures compared to before the closures. And in the Neuse River, abundance was significantly lower after the closures compared to before the closures. We also evaluated adult striped bass abundance using data from the WRC Spawning Ground Electrofishing Survey. The sampling occurs in the upper portions of the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers on the spawning grounds in the spring. And just to note that no sampling occurred in 2020 due to COVID restrictions. On these figures, the dashed line is the mean abundance pre-closures, and the dotted line is the mean abundance post-closures. In the Tar-Pamlico River, abundance increased slightly from 2019 through 2024, but mean abundance after the closures was still 20% lower than before the closures. In the Neuse River, abundance is highly variable from year to year, but mean abundance decreased by 6% post-closures. For the WRC spawning ground survey in the Tar-Pamlico River, man-Kendall trend test analysis indicated a negative abundance trend before the closures and no trend after the closures. On the spawning grounds in the Neuse River, there was no trend before or after the closures. The randomization test indicated striped bass abundance on the Tar-Pamlico River spawning grounds was significantly less after the closures compared to before the closures. And abundance on the Neuse River spawning grounds was not significantly different after the closures compared to before the closures. The next piece of data we'll look at is parentage-based tagging, or PBT. PBT techniques use a fin clip sample to identify a fish as hatchery or non-hatchery by using genetic microsatellite markers to match stock fish with brood fish used in the hatchery production. This method has been used by WRC since 2010 from the spawning ground surveys and from the Tar-Pamlico River and from the Tar-Pamlico Neuse rivers. And DMF has opportunistically collected fin clip samples from 2016 from fishery independent and dependent sampling programs in the lower and middle Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers to genetically identify stock fish. To orient everyone to this figure shows the percentage of hatchery or stocked adult striped bass as determined by genetic analysis in DMF and WRC sampling from 2013 through 2024 in the Tar-Pamlico River. WRC data is green and starts in 2013, and DMF data is in checkered blue and starts in 2016. WRC sampling occurs upriver on the spawning grounds, and DMF sampling occurs downriver. The black line represents 50%. From 2013 to 2024, PBT analysis of samples collected on the spawning grounds and from internal coastal waters of the Tar-Pamlico indicates stock striped bass can make up greater than 90% of fish sampled in some years. However, in 2017, 18, and 19, there was a noticeable decrease in the contribution of stock fish by both agencies in the Tar-Pamlico River. In 2021, WRC sampling on the spawning grounds indicated higher levels of stock fish, where DMF sampling downriver had much lower levels of stock fish, around 50%. We see a similar pattern in the Neuse River from 2013 to 2024. There are high levels of stock fish in 2017 and 2018. That percentage dropped, especially in the DMF sampling. And then in 2021, there was a high percentage of stock striped bass on the spawning grounds, but the percentage was much lower in the division's downriver sampling, again around 50%. PBT sampling doesn't tell us the origin of wild fish, so they could have been produced from the Tar-Pamlico or Neuse River spawning grounds. However, we do think there is strong evidence to suggest these wild fish that show up periodically actually originate from the AR system. And we'll talk about this more at the end of the presentation. Now we'll look at our striped bass age data specific to the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers to get an idea of the age structure. This figure shows the sample proportion at age for striped bass otoliths collected from DMF sampling programs in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers from 2013 through 2024. It's ages 0 through 12, which is the maximum otolith age. If we focus here on the red portion of each column, these are the percentages of age 6 fish. Striped bass age 6 are commonly encountered in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers. This slide shows that striped bass age 6 and under make up around 90% of all age fish in all years. Fish older than age 10, represented in bright green boxes at the top of this figure, are rare and make up less than 2% of the age samples in most years, except in 2014 and 2024, which was 4% in 2014 and 4.6% in 2024. And even though the percentage of age 7 fish did increase in 2024, the percentage of younger fish, specifically age 2 and 3, decreased, further highlighting that recruitment is really limiting these populations. Now we'll take a look at some of our fishery-dependent data. While the harvest closure limited fishery-dependent sampling, we do have information about the discards from the Recreational Creel Survey and from the Commercial Gillnet Observer Program. This table shows recreational striped bass fishing effort measured by the number of trips, harvest, numbers in pounds, discards, and total catch. In the 3 years prior to the closure, there were an average of around 22,000 trips per year for striped bass, harvesting around 5,800 fish and discarding around 85,000 mostly undersized fish. Since the closure in March of 2019, the number of recreational striped bass trips have dropped, averaging around 4,000, and discards have dropped to an average around 21,000. This table shows number of observed onboard large mesh and small mesh anchored gillnet trips in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers. It also shows the number of striped bass harvested when the season was open prior to 2019, and the number of observed dead or alive striped bass discards from 2012 to 2024. In the 3 years prior to the harvest closure and the gillnet closures, an average of 173 gillnet trips were observed per year, and an average of 89 striped bass were observed as harvested, and 103 were observed discards. After the gillnet closure in 2019, the number of observed striped bass has averaged 5 fish per year. The decrease in number of observed striped bass is due in part to prohibiting the use of gillnets above the ferry lines and harvest restrictions in other fisheries, most notably southern flounder, that have significantly limited the use of anchored large mesh gillnets. Amendment 2, adaptive management, also included a provision to maintain the gillnet prohibition through 2024 to allow for its assessment of its performance. To do this, we used a Mann-Kendall and randomization test to evaluate if abundance of striped bass above the ferry lines in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers has changed since implementation of the closures in 2019. The ferry line gillnet closure analysis only used Program 915 data from the areas above the ferry lines for the periods before and after management measures were put in place. The Mann-Kendall test indicated there was no significant trend in striped bass abundance above the ferry lines in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers before the closures, and more importantly, after the closures, there was no significant trend. Ideally, we would like to see an increase in striped bass abundance after management measures were put in place as the stock recovers. The randomization test for the Tar-Pamlico River indicated striped bass abundance above the ferry line was significantly lower after the closures compared to before the closures. And we see the same thing in the Neuse River. Abundance of striped bass above the ferry line is significantly less after the closures. So what does all this mean? To recap some key results. Only 2 wild juvenile striped bass have been caught seining in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse River since sampling started in 2017. The percentage of hatchery striped bass on the spawning grounds of the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers has increased to nearly 100%. The percentage of hatchery origin striped bass in the lower Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers has been variable, ranging from less than 50% to greater than 90%. Abundance in the lower river has declined and is lower after the closure than before. Abundance on the spawning grounds did not increase after the closures. Considering these results, we'll now look at some potential reasons why management was ineffective. As part of Amendment 2, a matrix model was used to evaluate stocking and management strategies. The reason I bring this up is that the matrix model provided predictions and indicated under all management scenarios that abundance of age 3 fish was projected to begin to increase in 2 years after the closure. And abundance of older age 6 plus striped bass would start to increase after 6 years in 2024, but we haven't seen that. The model predictions have not been met. We haven't seen increases in abundance of younger or older fish. So why haven't we seen that? First, it's difficult to pinpoint exact reasons for why management has been ineffective because there are so many different factors all working together that influence striped bass populations. Environmental conditions in these rivers include low flow, warm water temperatures, and low dissolved oxygen, maybe limiting natural recruitment. Similar to river systems in the CSMA, striped bass stocks in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida started declining in the 1970s or earlier, and now reproduction is limited and harvest is supported by extensive stocking programs. The introduction of striped bass on the West Coast and recovery of striped bass in the St. Lawrence River provide examples of where it took only a few stock fish to naturally produce large numbers of fish when environmental conditions are suitable, suggesting low abundance in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers may not be a limiting factor. Studies have estimated total mortality, which is natural and fishing mortality combined, is very high on Tar-Pamlico and Neuse River striped bass stocks. As an example, a study in the Neuse River calculated a total mortality rate of 66.3% for hatchery-produced Phase 2 striped bass and an annual total mortality of 54% for adults. Since fishing mortality has been significantly reduced, but abundance has not increased, it's likely natural mortality is very high. And while fishing mortality has been minimized through the harvest closure and the ferry line gillnet closures, recreational discards remain a source of fishing mortality. While the goal of stocking has been to stock 100,000 Phase 2 size fish per river annually, that goal has not always been met. And recently, stocking resources have shifted towards maintaining and restoring the AR stock in 2024. Not being able to meet this goal in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers may confound the ability of the stocks to grow. But as noted previously, given the right environmental conditions, very few individuals can naturally produce large numbers of fish. Conventional tagging data indicates annual movement of striped bass between the Albemarle Sound and the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers. Studies have shown increased movement of smaller AR stock striped bass into the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers during periods of increased stock abundance, with studies estimating up to 31% of AR stock could use areas outside of the Albemarle Sound during times of high abundance. So there's potential the increased numbers of wild fish observed in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers in 2017 and 18 could be spillover from the Albemarle Sound. But genetic testing doesn't tell us if that's the case. It doesn't tell us where they came from. So knowing this, in response to increased abundance of wild striped bass present in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers in 2017 and 18, DMF initiated an acoustic telemetry study to track movements of wild fish. Because striped bass return to natal or their home rivers to spawn, the objective of the acoustic tagging study was to infer origin of the wild striped bass by tracking spring spawning migrations. In total, we acoustic tagged 25 fish in the Tar-Pamlico River and 25 fish in the Neuse River. Genetic samples were collected from all striped bass in the study, and 30 of the adult striped bass tagged in the lower middle Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers were determined to be wild. And 70% of those were detected in the Albemarle Sound or on the Roanoke River spawning grounds in the spring. Because the tags used in this study have a lifespan of 10 years, we were able to track some of these fish for several years. And what we've seen is 5 of the wild fish have made repeated annual migrations between the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers and the Roanoke River spawning grounds, meaning they've made multiple spawning runs in the Roanoke River, but then always come back to reside in the Tar-Pamlico or Neuse rivers, so they're likely AR fish living in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers. These results suggest a high percentage of wild fish we see in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers likely originated from the Roanoke River, not from the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers. We also saw that 2 wild striped bass tagged in the Tar-Pamlico River were later detected on the spawning grounds in the Tar River, and 1 wild striped bass tagged in the Neuse River was later detected on the spawning grounds in the Neuse River, which suggests some limited recruitment in these rivers or some low level of strain, meaning small numbers of AR fish may make spawning runs in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers. More detailed information about this acoustic tagging study can be found in Appendix 3 of the data analysis paper. So this slide shows an example of striped bass movement patterns between the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers and the Albemarle Roanoke system. The map shows an acoustic tag detection of an individual wild striped bass from spring 2020 through spring 2023. Detections that occurred at stationary listening receivers are shown as circles, which are shaded according to the month of detection. Lighter colors are earlier in the year, dark colors are later in the year. This fish was collected, tagged, and released in the middle Tar-Pamlico River in December 2019 and is shown as a red dot and was identified as a wild fish based on genetics. This fish was detected over multiple years during the spring spawning season in the Albemarle Roanoke River, shown in light gray, and returned to the Tar-Pamlico River to reside throughout the rest of the year, which is shown in black, white, and dark gray circles. This shows an animation of that fish's movement between the Tar-Pamlico and the Roanoke River spawning grounds from spring 2020 through spring 2023. This fish made repeated trips up the Roanoke in the spring for 4 years in a row, but each time came back to the Tar-Pamlico River in the summer, winter, and fall to reside. This map is laid out similarly, but provides an example of striped bass movement patterns between the Neuse River and the Albemarle Roanoke system. This fish was collected, tagged, and released in the lower Neuse River in February 2020, which is shown as a red circle, and it was identified as a wild fish. The fish was detected multiple years during the spawning run in the Albemarle Sound, which is shown in the light gray, and returned to the Neuse to reside throughout the rest of the year, which is shown as the black, white, and dark gray circles. Again, this shows an animation of that fish's repeated movement between the Neuse River and the Roanoke River spawning grounds from the spring 2020 through spring 2022. This fish was detected in the spring for 3 years in a row on the Roanoke River spawning grounds and returned to the Neuse River the rest of the year. So this figure shows a juvenile abundance for the AR stock from 1955 through 2024. While abundance of AR stock striped bass is currently very low, 2014 and 2015 represent the most recent strong year classes produced. These strong year classes coincide with the year classes of the wild fish that showed up in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers in 2017 and 2018. It's likely there was spillover of these strong year classes into the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers, creating the appearance of natural reproduction, when in reality these fish were from the AR stock. So let's look at some conclusions from the data review. First, the harvest closure and gill net closure have been ineffective at increasing adult abundance, expanding the age structure, and promoting recruitment. The Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers striped bass stocks are currently not sustainable. Factors other than fishing mortality and inadequate spawning stock abundance are preventing sustainability of the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse River striped bass stocks. Most of the wild fish in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers are likely part of the AR stock. Environmental factors and declines in the AR stock have contributed to reduced striped bass abundance in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers. Additional management aimed at trying to achieve sustainability of these stocks is unlikely to be effective unless significant environmental improvements occur. Since the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse River stocks are currently not self-sustaining populations, our next steps, consistent with Amendment 2 Adaptive Management Framework, is DMF and WRC will begin developing harvest management measures allowing access to and protection for the resource, meaning allowing limited harvest. These next adaptive management steps are also consistent with the Amendment 2 goal, which includes if biological and/or environmental factors prevent a self-sustaining population, then alternative management strategies will be implemented that provide protection for and access to the resource. So consistent with Amendment 2 goal and adaptive management framework, DMF and WRC have begun exploring management measures that will provide protection for and access to the resource. This means that striped bass harvest closure in these rivers would end. Management measures will be implemented to control harvest of stock fish and maintain mature fish in the system so that if there are favorable environmental conditions, natural reproduction could occur. The AR stock is overfished and overfishing is occurring, and we know a portion of this stock resides in the lower Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers during certain times of the year. Measures will focus harvest on stock fish by limiting harvest opportunities to areas and seasons when AR fish are less abundant. Preliminary potential harvest management is likely to include an open recreational harvest season in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers from April 1 to April 30 with the intent of opening harvest in 2026. Tagging data indicates most AR fish leave the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers by April, so limiting the season to this month should minimize harvest of those fish. There would be a 1 fish per person per day recreational limit. With an 18 to 22 inch harvest slot or 1 fish greater than 27 inches, which is consistent with the current rule. The DMF and WRC biologists have discussed the harvest of fish greater than 27 inches and agreed it's very unlikely many of these fish would be harvested. And a rule change could be undertaken, but it may prevent harvest from occurring for 2 years. Harvest will not be allowed throughout the entire river. We are currently reviewing tagging and PBT data to determine the downstream extent of harvest that will minimize harvest of AR striped bass. So for next steps, we plan to continue reviewing tagging and PBT data to determine the downstream extent of harvest. We will explore commercial harvest measures that would direct commercial harvest on stock fish while minimizing harvest of Albemarle Roanoke striped bass. Amendment 2 adaptive management allows for a hook and line as a commercial gear. And at the November 2025 MFC business meeting, we'll present a harvest management plan for the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers. And prior to your November meeting, we plan to hold an informational meeting with the public to discuss the harvest plan and answer questions. In the meantime, the WRC must take action because the inland fishing waters of the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers are closed by WRC rule and cannot be opened without a rule change. WRC temporary rulemaking needs to begin no later than October 2025 for an April 2026 season to occur in inland waters. So we've talked about the next steps on striped bass management. Now let's go over next steps for the gillnet closure upstream of the ferry lines. So for some context, it's helpful to review the origins of this gillnet closure. On March 13, 2019, the MFC held an emergency meeting and approved a motion to direct the director of the DMF, who was bound by law, to issue a proclamation effective in conjunction with Supplement A that prohibits the use of gillnets upstream of the ferry lines from the Bayview to Aurora Ferry on the Tar-Pamlico River and from the Minnesota Beach to Cherry Branch Ferry on the Neuse River. Given this requirement, a proclamation prohibiting the use of all gillnets upstream of the ferry lines in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers was issued on March 15, 2019. Amendment 2 to the Estuarine Striped Bass FMP was adopted in November 2022. And the motion to adopt Amendment 2 included language to maintain the gillnet prohibition through 2024 to allow for assessments of its performance. Given this provision, without additional commission action, the MFC's attorney interprets the motion as meaning that the gillnet closure above the ferry lines in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse River sunsets. Based on this interpretation, the ferry line closure would no longer be in place. This does not mean, however, that striped bass will lose protection in gillnet fisheries. Additional proclamations would be issued to reinstitute restrictions that were in place before the 2019 closures. As a reminder, these gillnet restrictions had been chosen because data showed that they significantly minimized striped bass bycatch. For large mesh gillnets, these restrictions include the use of 3-foot tie downs and 50-yard distance from shore requirements, including the areas above the ferry lines when large mesh gillnets are allowed. For small mesh gillnets, previous restrictions that will go back into place above the ferry lines include attendance and distance from shore requirements. So that brings us to our timeline. There is no action related to striped bass for the MFC today. DMF and WRC staff are working through Amendment 2 adaptive management process to develop a plan for allowing harvest of striped bass in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers with the intent of opening harvest in 2026. We will present the harvest plan to the MFC at your November 2025 meeting. Prior to your November meeting, we plan to hold an informational meeting with the public to discuss the harvest plan and answer questions. And with that, Charlton and I will take any of your questions about the data review or proposed striped bass management moving forward, or we can just get into the gillnets.